React props is what we'll be learning in this video. This tutorial on React properties will tell you the fundamentals of how they operate, how you can pass down properties from one component to another, how they work in terms of the React ecosystem, and how to implement them in your next app or website. If you haven't heard of me before, I'm Adrian from Australia. I do videos around design and development, so if you guys haven't already, hit like and subscribe and we're just gonna jump straight into it. For this tutorial, I'm going to be following a lot of the standards that we're using in the actual best practice here in React so that we can do things properly. You can visit reactjs.org here to see the official documentation, but we're going to be opening this up in CodePen, which will be accessible here as well. I'll link it in the description below, but what we're going to do is a basic hello world, where we essentially pass down props to understand how they work. Here is our CodePen, and this just has a basic HTML tag here with an ID of root, and we're rendering React in here. We're actually running React DOM.render, and we're creating a h1 tag in here that says React props, and we're applying this here to the root element that essentially is up here in our HTML. Now, the very first thing I want to be able to do is create a new functional component here in React. So what I'm going to pass in is function, maybe app. We'll call this as a function with a return. And in this return, we're simply going to copy over this h1 tag. Now inside of our React DOM, I'm going to pass in the app as a tag, and I'm going to close it off here. When we do this, we'll see that React pops up in here, but we haven't applied any props in here just yet. Now, properties are very similar to how we used to do stuff in tags in regular HTML. Sometimes we would pass in classes or styles, but in React we do this a little bit different. For example, here I'm going to pass in a prop, and this I'm going to call title. Now, like an input, this is just a string right now, and we're going to type in React props example here. For this title, we can now access it here inside of our function. To be able to do this, we open up the curly braces and access props.title. When we do this, we'll see that it will pop in here, but we have to also call it inside of our function. So let's pass in props here. And now when we refresh, we can see React props example has shown up. Now this is really cool because we could take out the example now, and this will automatically update here. So this is dynamic essentially now. And we could render out additional apps in here that would have the prop that we assign. If we were to, for example, take out this prop entirely, we would have no text in here. But there is another thing to this. If we don't put anything in here, we also won't have anything inside of our CodePen. But if we check the inspect in here, we'll actually see that there is content in here. There is a h1 tag, but there's simply no content inside of it. So this is something that we need to be aware of when we're doing props. There are a few options around that. We could do a question mark here, and this would check whether the prop exists. If it does, we simply can do props.title and it prints it out. But if it doesn't, we could say empty or maybe even NA. And this way we know that a title hasn't been applied. This will work every time we pass it in. So for example, even if it's an empty string, NA will pop up. But if we put in, for example, props example in this text, then you'll see that the NA will disappear and the props example text will pop up. Now this is a pretty simple use case example of props, and this in this example is us just passing in a string. But there are other things we can do with props as well. For example, in this h1 tag, we can't simply pass in class name button in here. This is because as a React ecosystem, class is actually a class name that is predefined, and we simply can't utilize this. So in React, you'll find that class actually comes up as class name. And this is where we can pass in the button name, or we could pass in, for example, all sorts of stuff. But in this use case, we're just going to leave it as button. The next thing we need to know in terms of props is that we can still use styles, but we can't pass in a style like color red. This is because the React ecosystem does its styling a little bit differently. What we have to do instead is pass in an object. So in here we can pass in a parameter of red as a string, and this should apply to the essential tag over here. But this is more or less how React does its props in terms of styling. If we wanted to apply another prop in here, for example, maybe we wanted the background here to be white, we would pass this in as a separate property. This essentially means that sometimes styling can be a little bit difficult if you're doing inline styling for React, but because of this, normally there are other libraries like styled components, which makes this a lot easier. Of course, you can still do your styling normally, like in here you can pass in button, and in your CSS then, you can create a class called button, which you can apply some styling to, such as making the color red, and we should see that apply. Let's take this out for the time being, and let's have a look at some other things we can do here in terms of the actual props. Now, as a property, there are different ways we can pass things down. We don't always have to pass down a string. We can also pass in a number. So let's do, say, example here as a number 2. This is now a number that we're passing into our functional component. And for this, I might just pass it in here below. So in this case, I'm going to pass in example, and let's make sure that we pass in props beforehand. And we should see that the number 2 appears in here. Because it's a number, we can add +1 to it, and this should pop in as number 3. But if we were to do a +1 here to the string, we'll see that obviously it's a string, it's just going to print out as a string over here. So let's remove that for the time being, but that's how the numbers work. Now that we have 2 props, one here as a string and one here as a number, let's do a third type of prop. What I'm going to do is create an array here of animals. This array will be inside of our curly braces, and I'm just going to pass in a few in here. So we'll pass in cat, dog, and maybe bird. This is an array of animals that we can now access as a prop here inside of our app. So what I'm going to do is inside of our h1 tag, this isn't probably the best way to do it, but I'm just going to do it like this, a UL, and we'll close this UL off. And here I want to map through our props that we're getting. So I'm going to pass in props.animals.map, and here we're going to do maybe a animal as a value, and we're going to pass this in as an li tag and close that off. Now inside of this li tag, we want to be able to essentially pass in the actual animal itself. So I'm just going to pass it in here. But the other thing that we're going to have to do is we're going to have to assign a key as a prop here as well. So I'm just going to pass it here in as animal as well. Now that we have both of these, we essentially have a list of animals. And the way this has worked is it's gone through our prop here, which is an array. It's passed it down to our app, which we've mapped it out, and we've assigned it to loop through each one and print out. There is a better way to do this. We can actually pass it down into its own component. There's a few ways we could do this. So the very first is to create a new functional component here called animals. We're going to pass in a function with a return here, and this return will give us our list. Now this list will start with the UL, and we actually already have the code for that. So I'm just going to copy it and paste it straight in here. And we're going to put this prop along with this component, which is a functional component, right into our app. Now when we do this, we're going to have an error. And this error here is this map error, because we haven't defined a prop here on animals. So one thing we can do actually is we can check if there is a props.animal. And if there is, only then map it out. When we do this, we won't have the error popping up. Now, what we can do is we can actually grab these animals and we could actually paste them straight in here as a prop inside of our app. Now that's one way we can pass it down. Of course, sometimes they might actually exist on our parent component. Now, if we wanted to pass it down, we can actually pass it down multiple levels of children. So in this case, we're creating it here in our app, and we're receiving it here in our app, and we can pass it down once more. So in this case, I'm going to pass in animals here, and this will grab props.animals. When we do this, we can see that they've passed down accordingly. So we've passed them from our render, where we're calling app, down to our animals, which is then mapping it out. This is an example of how you can continuously pass down different types of props inside of a React app. This, of course, means we can also pass down the title or the example, or a number of other things. Now, all these examples we've done so far are with functional components, and props work a little bit different when it comes to class components. Let's create class animal extends React component, and in here we'll do render, return, and for our return, I think we'll just do a list in here. So li, we'll close that off. And for this list, we'll do the animal inside of here. Now for this animal, right now, let's replace our list items in here with this animal. Now, there's a few things that we can take note of. Let's actually put in a index in here, and let's create that index. So we're mapping through our items, we're grabbing the animal, and we're grabbing an index in here. We're passing this index here as a prop, and we're also passing in the animal here as some text. Now, inside of our class component, what we want to do is we want to be able to pass in the name of the animal. For a class component, we actually have to call this.props before we call props. This is because we're not passing it down like we are in a functional component. But once we do, we can just pass in animal over here, and we'll see that that will pop up. We can also pass in the actual index of the animal too. So actually we'll pass it right in here, and we should see all of that pop up. Now, if we have a look, animal didn't actually pop up as a child here. And this is because it's actually inside of our component. When content is inside of our component, it renders a little bit different. We actually call props.children. This is a React prop that essentially passes down anything inside of the tag here that we create. And in this case, inside of the tag, we're passing in the name of the animal. We can also apply this same sort of principle here inside of animals. So for example, if we were to take out the closing tag and create this tag in here to close outside and put in a test string in here, we wouldn't see it pop up inside of animals, but inside of animals over here, we could create a new list item that we can close off. And in here, we can pass in props.children, and we'll see that apply as well. As you can see here inside of our functional component, we don't have to call this.props because we're passing it down in here. But inside of our class components, we do. This gives us an example of how we can use the props inside of a class component, inside of a functional component, and how we can also pass in children items. Children aren't limited to just strings. We can pass in all sorts of stuff in here. We can even pass in additional, say, components or nest components indefinitely. And this is the fundamental of how props work inside of React. One thing to note with props is that they're technically read-only. We can't really edit them, but we can redefine them. For example, doing this calculation over here won't actually change this prop. It'll just essentially update what its value is after we do the calculation. There are other ways we could do this as well. For example, instead of passing in the prop here as a +1, we could actually go down here. So here we have our index, and this index is technically starting off here at 0. And say we wanted it to start off at 1. We could cut this out, and we could call this, say, index, and we could create let index equal this.props.index +1. Here we're creating a new value for index, and we're passing it into our component. We're not editing it, but we are creating that new variable for it just over here. This is one way we can use props to define new types of characteristics for our application. The other thing we can do, especially for a React class component, is to maybe store it, maybe in state or something like that. If we wanted to do that, we would have to call a constructor. Calling a constructor is perfectly fine, but we won't have access to the props unless we pass it in over here, as well as pass in super.props. With that done, we can create new properties in here for our state. Now this is something that we might take a look at in the next video, so I'm going to keep this very simple. But in this case, we're going to create an index. And this index will be created from this.props.index +1. We'll be able to see that in here, and we won't be applying it just yet. We'll get rid of this let index equals, and in here we're going to pass in this.state.index. When we do, we'll essentially have the same results here, but this is getting pulled in from our state this time instead of our props. But our props is defining it. If we were to, say, create another animal in here, say maybe a test animal, then we'll see that these numbers will update automatically and they still work just fine. So I'm going to get rid of that one for the time being. But this is an example of how it works. Of course, we can define state as anything we want. We can even put the state here with the animal name. And this is something we'll check in the next video. But I hope you like this introduction into props with React. This is just a brief tutorial and there's a lot more to it, but hopefully this should get you up and running. If you enjoyed this video, hit like, hit subscribe. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.